Oklahoma, autumn 2003. A cool wind rolled across the flat plains outside Tulsa, carrying with it the scent of rain and the faint hum of highway traffic in the distance. It was the kind of evening when the sky burned orange before fading into gray, when small-town life slowed down and families settled in for the night. But on that October evening, in the quiet suburb of Broken Arrow, peace shattered without warning. 23-year-old Kayla Henderson never made it home. She had left her late shift at a local diner just after 11 p.m., calling her mother to say she was on her way. 15 minutes later, her car was found parked along a rural service road. Driver's door slightly open, headlights still glowing against the darkness. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. The keys dangled from the ignition, but Kayla was gone. The discovery sparked one of the largest searches the area had seen in years. Volunteers, neighbors, and police combed through fields and wooded patches for days. Flyers went up on telephone poles and gas stations across Tulsa County. Local TV anchors spoke her name with somber urgency. But as days turned into weeks, hope turned into fear. And then, 6 days after she vanished, a jogger stumbled upon a grim scene near an old grain silo, less than 5 miles from where her car had been found. Kayla's body was discovered partially concealed beneath brush. Her mother, Diane Henderson, said later that she knew the moment she saw the police pull up to her driveway what had happened. "You can feel it," she told a reporter years later. "Her mother knows when her child's heart has stopped beating." The crime stunned the community. Kayla wasn't the type to take risks. She was careful, responsible, always checking in with her family. She'd been saving to go back to college, studying early childhood education. In her small apartment, police found lesson plans she'd written by hand, and on the refrigerator a note she had left for herself. "Keep going. It's all going to work out." Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a brutal, targeted attack. Evidence at the scene suggested Kayla had fought back. Detectives collected fibers, soil samples, and fingerprints from her car, but the technology available in 2003 could only do so much. The partial prints lifted from her vehicle and a soda can near the body didn't match anyone in the local or state databases. DNA recovered was degraded and inconclusive. The leads ran dry within months. For the Broken Arrow Police Department, the case became a haunting presence. Every year a new detective would revisit it, flipping through the old binders filled with photos, maps, and lab reports. But with no new evidence, no suspects, and no confessions, the case quietly slipped into the growing list of cold files. For Diane Henderson, however, it never faded. She kept Kayla's room untouched for years. The bed neatly made, her clothes folded in drawers, her favorite denim jacket still hanging by the door. Every morning she'd light a candle by her daughter's photograph and whisper, "We're still looking, sweetheart." By 2010, most people in the community assumed the case would never be solved. But one detective refused to let it go. His name was Mark Ellison, a veteran investigator known for his methodical approach and quiet persistence. He had joined the department just months after Kayla's murder and had always felt a personal connection to the case. "Something about it never sat right," he later said. "It wasn't random. Whoever did this knew her, or at least knew her routine." Ellison would spend years revisiting the evidence whenever new forensic techniques emerged. But it wasn't until 2021, nearly 2 decades later, that a breakthrough finally came, thanks to technology that hadn't existed back in 2003. That summer, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation announced a statewide effort to reprocess cold case evidence using advanced fingerprint reanalysis software, technology capable of identifying partial and distorted prints that older systems had missed. Ellison immediately submitted the Henderson case materials, including the lifted prints from Kayla's car and the soda can. He didn't expect much. In his experience, false hope was more common than miracles. But in December 2021, the results came back, and this time, the prints matched. The name that appeared on the report was one no one expected: Charles Chuck Delaney, 44 years old, a former handyman who had lived less than a mile from Kayla's apartment in 2003. He had no prior record of violent crime, just minor theft and trespassing charges. He had moved out of Oklahoma in 2004 and settled in Missouri, living quietly, working construction, and raising 2 children. When Ellison received the report, he sat in stunned silence at his desk for several minutes before picking up the phone. After 18 years, he said, the case finally spoke. Detectives coordinated with Missouri state authorities to quietly monitor Delaney's movements. They built a profile, interviewing former neighbors, employers, and even members of his family. Everyone described him the same way: quiet, polite, helpful. You'd never think he was capable of something like that, one neighbor told investigators. But the evidence was clear. The partial fingerprint on Kayla's car door and the full one from the soda can were both his. On a cold morning in February 2022, Ellison and a small team traveled to Springfield, Missouri, where Delaney was living. They watched as he left his house for work, carrying a thermos and toolbox. When officers approached and identified themselves, Delaney didn't resist. He looked confused, almost dazed, as if the past had suddenly reached out and grabbed him by the throat. When asked if he knew a woman named Kayla Henderson, he said quietly, "I haven't heard that name in years." That was all Ellison needed to hear. After nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, the investigation that had haunted Broken Arrow was about to come full circle. When Charles Delaney was led into the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office for questioning, nearly 20 years had passed since Kayla Henderson's murder. The once young handyman was now middle-aged, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined by years of quiet labor and ordinary life. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He seemed confused more than defensive. But when Detective Mark Ellison walked into the room, file in hand, something in Delaney's expression shifted. Ellison placed a single photograph on the table: Kayla, smiling in her diner uniform, hair tucked behind her ear. "You remember her, don't you?" Ellison asked. Delaney looked down, silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "She worked over at Mill Creek." Diner. That was the first admission, the thread that began to unravel the story buried for nearly 2 decades. Delaney explained that he used to stop by the diner after late-night jobs, usually for coffee and pie. "She was always nice," he said. "She'd talk to everyone. Never made you feel like you were just some guy." But as the conversation deepened, it became clear that Delaney's connection to Kayla had gone beyond casual interaction. He had developed an obsession, one he kept hidden from those around him, through questioning. Investigators pieced together that Delaney had followed Kayla home several times after her shifts, something he initially denied, but later admitted in fragments. When confronted with the fingerprint evidence, his prints on her car door and the soda can found near her body, Delaney went quiet. For almost a full minute he stared at the table, breathing heavily. Then, with tears in his eyes, he whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." According to the confession that followed, Delaney had approached Kayla the night she disappeared, offering to help fix her headlights, which she had mentioned earlier that week at work. When she declined and tried to drive away, he panicked, angry that she didn't trust him. What happened next, he claimed, was a blur of rage and fear. He struck her, pulled her from the car and drove her to the service road. He said he just wanted to talk, but the encounter spiraled into violence that ended with her death. He left her there, half covered in brush, and drove home, disposing of her belongings along the way. It was a confession that broke open the quiet grief that had hung over Broken Arrow for nearly 20 years. When news of the arrest reached the community, old wounds reopened. Local radio stations replayed archived news clips from 2003, social media filled with tributes, old memories, and disbelief. "I worked with Kayla that night," one former co-worker posted. "We all thought she'd been taken by someone passing through. Never imagined it was someone who sat at the counter every week." For Diane Henderson, the call came early that morning. Detective Ellison's voice was calm but emotional. "We got him," he said simply. Diane dropped the phone, her knees giving way. For years she had prayed for closure, though when it came it didn't feel like peace. "It's strange," she later told a local reporter. "You wait all that time to hear those words, and when they finally come it doesn't heal you. It just confirms that the nightmare was real." As the details of the case resurfaced, prosecutors moved swiftly. The evidence was strong. Fingerprints, a partial DNA confirmation consistent with Delaney, and his own taped confession. But the most haunting piece of evidence came from something left behind in Kayla's apartment, a small notepad she used for work notes. On one of the final pages, written just days before her death, were the words, "Guy from the diner keeps watching me. Feels weird. Be careful." That single note, long overlooked in early investigations, took on devastating clarity in court. The trial took place in late 2023, nearly 20 years after Kayla's murder. By then Diane was older, her hair silver, her voice steadier but still carrying the same quiet heartbreak. She sat through every hearing, every motion, every piece of evidence presented. She wanted to look the man who took her daughter's life in the eye. During testimony, Ellison described the decades-long pursuit that led to the arrest. "This case became part of who I am," he said. "Every detective has one that stays with them. This was mine." Delaney, sitting at the defense table, barely spoke throughout the proceedings. His attorney argued that the crime was the result of impulsive behavior fueled by emotional instability, but the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence, though aged, was undeniable. In November 2023, after only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Delaney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, Diane Henderson spoke softly to a group of reporters. "There's no such thing as justice for something like this," she said. "But maybe now Kayla can rest." Detective Ellison retired the following spring. On his last day, he stopped by the Henderson home with a small box of case materials, photos, reports, and a thank you letter signed by the State Crime Lab team. "You kept her name alive," Diane told him through tears. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You did." In the years since, Kayla's story has been used in training seminars for cold case investigators across Oklahoma, a reminder of how persistence, technology, and timing can finally bring answers to even the most forgotten cases. Today, a small memorial stands near the grain silo where her body was found. Locals still leave flowers there every October. On the plaque beneath her photo are 5 simple words that capture both the loss and the endurance of those left behind. She was never forgotten. After the verdict, life in Broken Arrow moved quietly forward, though for many, the air still carried a weight that couldn't be named. The headlines faded, the camera crews left, but the absence remained, a hollow echo of the years when Kayla's name had been a question instead of an answer. For Diane Henderson, grief had become something steady and predictable. It no longer came in waves but in low tides, quiet, constant, and woven into the rhythm of her days. She visited Kayla's grave every Sunday, always with fresh wildflowers. Sometimes she spoke to her daughter out loud. Other times she simply stood in silence, letting the wind fill the spaces between what was said and what could never be. In early 2024, she received a letter from one of the forensic analysts at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, a young woman named Rachel Miles, who had helped re-examine the fingerprint that broke the case open. Rachel wrote about how, when she first started working in the lab, Kayla's file was one of the cases she read about during training. "I never forgot her," Rachel wrote. "We all hoped that someday the science would catch up, and it finally did. That letter sat on Diane's kitchen counter for weeks before she framed it and placed it beside a photo of Kayla as a child holding a jar of lightning bugs on a summer night. It was a reminder that even strangers had carried a piece of her story through the years. Detective Mark Ellison, now retired, often found himself driving past the old diner where Kayla once worked. It had closed down years ago, replaced by a chain coffee shop, but in his mind, he could still see her through the window, wiping tables, laughing with customers, unaware of the darkness that had begun to circle her. Sometimes he'd park across the street for a few minutes, then drive away without getting out of the car. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was something quieter, the ache of unfinished empathy. In his final interview before retirement, Ellison spoke about the case to a local journalist. "When you work in homicide, you learn that time doesn't erase pain. It just changes its shape," he said. "We didn't just solve a case. We gave a voice back to someone who'd been silenced. That's what keeps you going." The story of Kayla Henderson began appearing in law enforcement seminars around the country, used as a case study in cold case methodology. The key lesson was persistence. The fingerprint that solved the case had been collected back in 2003, handled, logged, and filed correctly. But the technology to process its degraded quality simply hadn't existed at the time. It wasn't until 2021, when an updated fingerprint analysis program was introduced across federal databases, that the system flagged a match. The match came from a minor arrest Delaney had made in 2018, unrelated to violence. He'd been cited for an altercation outside a bar. His prints were entered into the national database, quietly sitting there for years, until technology finally connected the dots. For the investigators who worked the case in its early years, that breakthrough was both humbling and vindicating. "We did everything by the book back then," one retired officer said. "Sometimes it's not about what you missed. It's about what didn't exist yet." In the months following the conviction, community members organized a scholarship fund in Kayla's name for students pursuing criminal justice degrees. The fund was modest at first, mostly small donations from neighbors, co-workers, and retired officers, but it grew steadily, spreading across Oklahoma. The first recipient, a young woman named Lily Sanchez, sent a letter to Diane thanking her for allowing Kayla's legacy to live on. "I want to help solve cases like hers," Lily wrote. "Maybe one day I'll help bring someone else's mother peace." That letter too joined the frame on the kitchen counter. By 2025, Broken Arrow had changed. The town had grown. New neighborhoods had replaced the empty lots. And a generation had come of age with only second-hand memories of what had happened that spring night in 2003. But for those who had lived through it, the story never really went away. It just became part of the landscape. Like an old scar that doesn't hurt anymore, but still shows when the light hits it a certain way. Local reporters occasionally revisited the case on anniversaries, interviewing the people who had lived through it. One story aired in April 2025, marking 22 years since Kayla's death. In the interview, Diane spoke softly but with conviction. "For a long time I thought closure was about answers," she said. "But it's really about understanding that some pain stays with you and learning to live with it." The documentary that followed, titled Fingerprint of Time, aired later that year on a regional channel. It told the story from start to finish. The night Kayla disappeared, the years of silence, the fingerprint rediscovery, and the confession that finally ended the mystery. It included interviews with everyone still living who had been connected to the case. Detectives, lab technicians, even Kayla's old co-workers. One of them, a waitress named Brenda, shared a memory that stayed with viewers long after the credits rolled. "She used to draw little hearts on the diner receipts," Brenda said, laughing softly, "just to make people smile. I still have one in an old box somewhere. I couldn't throw it away." The film ended with footage of the memorial by the grain silo, the Oklahoma wind brushing across the fields, wildflowers bending gently. Over it, Diane's voice echoed from her interview. "We lost her once, but we found her again in the truth. And that truth, it belongs to all of us now." That was how Kayla Henderson's story finally settled into history, not as a headline or a file, but as a testament to what persistence and science can achieve, and to the quiet courage of those who refuse to give up. For the young analysts in state labs across the country, her case became a symbol of why they do what they do. Because somewhere in some drawer, there's always another fingerprint waiting for the right eyes, the right moment, the right breakthrough. And for Diane, that was enough. She didn't believe in happy endings anymore, but she believed in endings that mattered. And for her, that was all the justice she needed. In the years that followed the trial, the memory of Kayla Henderson remained woven into the fabric of Broken Arrow's community life. Her story was no longer just a tragedy whispered about in diners and barbershops. It had become a symbol of perseverance, of what happens when truth refuses to stay buried. By the summer of 2025, the Henderson home had grown quieter. The curtains that once stayed closed for years were now open again. Diane often sat by the window in the late afternoons, sunlight spilling across the floor where her daughter used to sit and read. Sometimes she still caught herself turning when she heard footsteps on the porch, expecting to see Kayla walking through the door. But instead of pain, there was now something gentler, a soft acceptance that time had finally done what it could. The town's new police chief, Aaron Mendez, was one of the youngest in Broken Arrow's history. He had been a teenager when Kayla disappeared, and he remembered the fear that gripped the community back then. To him, reopening cold cases wasn't just a procedural duty, it was personal. Under his leadership, the department began partnering with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation to re-examine older files, many of which had sat untouched for decades. "If science can find Kayla's killer," Mendez said during a press conference, "then it can find others. We owe that to every family still waiting for answers." The ripple effect of the Henderson case reached far beyond Oklahoma. Across the country, states began revisiting archived fingerprint evidence using the same enhanced imaging software that had identified Delaney's print. Federal grants were distributed to fund these efforts, prioritizing cases that had viable physical evidence, but no leads. Dozens of arrests followed, each one a story like Kayla's, long delayed but finally resolved. In 2024, the OSBI dedicated a new cold case lab wing in Oklahoma City. The walls displayed photographs of solved cases, each one representing a life reclaimed from silence. Near the entrance was a framed newspaper clipping of Kayla Henderson's story, the first major case the lab had helped solve using reanalysis technology. Below it, a small plaque read, "In memory of those who waited for justice and those who never stopped searching." For Mark Ellison, now fully retired, the dedication ceremony was bittersweet. He'd spent most of his career chasing ghosts, trying to stitch together broken timelines from fragments of evidence. Standing in that lab, surrounded by the hum of new machines and young faces full of purpose, he realized that every hour he'd spent combing through old files had meant something after all. "You can't change what's gone," he told one of the technicians quietly, "but you can make sure it doesn't stay forgotten." Back in Broken Arrow, Kayla's story had also found a place in the local school curriculum. Each spring, the high school hosted a week-long program called Community Justice Week, inviting detectives, forensic experts, and victim advocates to speak to students about awareness, safety, and empathy. On the final day, the students watched a short film about Kayla's case, the same documentary that had aired the year before. Many left the auditorium in silence, some wiping away tears. Diane attended the event that year as an honored guest. She was hesitant at first. Public appearances had never come easily to her, but she knew her daughter would have wanted her to be there. When she took the stage, she spoke softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in the room. "For a long time I thought justice meant punishment," she told the students. but it really means acknowledgement. It means someone saw her, someone listened, and someone cared enough to keep looking. After the program ended, a young girl approached Diane with tears in her eyes and handed her a folded note. It read, "I want to help people like Kayla. I want to make sure no one is forgotten." Diane tucked the note into her purse, next to a faded photo of Kayla, holding a birthday cake at age 12. Meanwhile, across the state, journalists and podcasters continued to tell Kayla's story. It became part of a larger national conversation about how emerging forensic technologies, like DNA genealogy, 3D imaging, and advanced fingerprint analysis, were rewriting the playbook for cold cases. One popular podcast, Voices Reclaimed, featured Kayla's mother and Detective Ellison in an episode that later went viral for its quiet power. "People think cold cases are just about science," Ellison said in the interview. "But they're really about persistence and empathy. Machines can find patterns, but only people can care enough to look." Delaney's death in prison in 2023 closed the legal chapter for good. He never expressed remorse, never offered additional information, never revealed the why behind his actions. For Diane, that unanswered question lingered like an old scar. She had imagined countless times what she might say to him if given the chance, but when the time came, she chose silence. "You can't reason with darkness," she told a reporter later, "but you can choose not to let it define you." In 2025, on what would have been Kayla's 40th birthday, friends and family gathered near the grain fields where she used to walk as a teenager. The air was cool and golden, the horizon wide and open. A small crowd released sky lanterns that drifted upward, glowing softly as they disappeared into the dusk. Diane stood beside her son, Luke, holding one lantern a moment longer than the rest before letting it go. "This is for you, sweetheart," she whispered as it rose higher, carried by the same wind that once brushed through her daughter's hair. Later that evening, as the town lights flickered in the distance, Diane sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee and the hum of crickets in the background. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that erased the pain. It was the kind that coexisted with it quietly, like two sides of the same memory. The fingerprint that had solved the case was now stored in a glass display at the Osby Training Center, used as an example for forensic trainees learning about reanalysis. Beneath it, a simple line read, "Recovered in 2003, identified in 2021, justice in 2023. Every new class that came through the center heard Kayla's story." They learned that justice isn't always immediate, that sometimes it takes decades for science to catch up to the truth, but that when it does, even the smallest trace, a single print, can rewrite history. For Diane Henderson, that was her daughter's legacy. Not just tragedy, but transformation. Kayla's story had given meaning to something that once seemed unbearable. It had shown that even the faintest evidence could bring a family out of darkness. And somewhere, in the soft quiet of an Oklahoma evening, Diane believed Kayla finally knew. The years after the case's closure brought a quiet transformation across Oklahoma. The story of Kayla Henderson had moved beyond tragedy and into legacy, becoming a lesson about how justice, even when delayed, could still find its way through time, persistence, and the unwavering dedication of those who refuse to forget. By late 2025, the Henderson Foundation for Cold Case Justice had grown larger than anyone expected. What began as a small local initiative organized by friends and family soon received statewide recognition. The foundation provided funding for advanced fingerprint imaging systems and forensic scholarships, ensuring that other investigators had the tools